we're going to talk to Phil. Phil, who's calling in from Texas. Phil, you're live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Good evening, gentlemen. Great show tonight. I have a quick story to tell you. Yes. I have a quick story to tell you. I'm 63, and in the 70s, when I was a teenager, I was a member of a Disciples of Christ church. The Disciples of Christ is a very even-handed, vanilla, kind of moderate Christian denomination. Our motto, it was and is, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, love. Now, they didn't tell us what those essentials were. It was up to us to decide. But something happened to our church in the early 70s. A bunch of the youth group went to what was then called a lay witness mission, where we spent a weekend at another church and, slept over, and there were healings and speaking in tongues and things like that. Well, we didn't do any of that in our church. So this kind of provided a thin entering wedge for, there was no such term as evangelical back then. It was charismatic. It was the charismatic movement. It was fundamentalist, and it was also the era of the Jesus people, guys with beards and guitars singing Kumbaya, stuff like that. So I just watched Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and that's kind of what it was like. They planted, well, I shouldn't ascribe motive, but this charismatic movement infiltrated our church, our very moderate church, and kind of split it, kind of took it over. Now, the thing I wanted to say mostly is back then, there was nothing political about it. There was no mention of Christian nationalism. It was all church oriented and person oriented. So in the meantime, the fundagelicals have grown teeth and claws. But people, and of course, I was a teenager, so I wanted to be the best possible Christian I could, and it was extremely confusing. It was very debilitating. I was enough of a science fan that I didn't quite buy in. I couldn't buy into a 6,000-year-old Earth or a global flood or anything like that. I think the moment that broke me was when I was in Sunday school, and a very, very nice man, I guess they decided they were going to give us the sex talk that day. And this very nice tall gentleman said, and I'll never forget this, he said, "The physical act of sex itself is extremely ugly."
Whoa. That definitely says more about his life than he meant to say, right? Yeah.
Even as a teenager, even as a 15-year-old, I thought, man, you're not doing it right.
Oh no. Oh man.
Ugly. So I eventually extricated myself. Actually, I went to a big Assembly of God church with my friend because they had a lot of good-looking girls. But
man, Phil, I'm glad you're honest about that. I feel like there's a lot of people that do that. I definitely knew people that were like that. But,
I found out years later they all went out in the parking lot and smoked dope afterwards. I wish I had known.
Oh, you could have joined in. Oh man.
Yeah. But I guess this point I want to make is it was different. It wasn't political back then, but it was insidious.
Well, you say that it's not political, and I believe it may be not for your church. But if you look at the history of the American evangelical movement in this country, really in the 60s and 70s, is when you're really starting to see the turn of these evangelical organizations switching political strategy and focusing on issues mainly things like abortion, but for some places interracial marriage, some other strange things. But there was definitely a shift in strategy. There's a great we really need to get the folks from the Straight White American Jesus podcast on, because they're real scholars on the subject. But they talk about this shift in movement in evangelical circles, because evangelical Christianity, out of all the forms of Christianity, has some of the most political influence in our country, in the United States, rather. And that's about that time period that you're talking about is when you're starting to see that shift. But it's funny that your encounters with, charismatic churches, as they're called, it is kind of so shocking. There's a great documentary called Marjo. I just looked it up.
I've seen that one.
Marjo, I think Marjo really tripped me out because you see people like, I'm just going to say it, like Joel Osteen. Okay. You see the big televangelist folks and you wonder, like, what do they do when they're not on camera? Like, how do they live their lives? Marjo is that. Marjo was this guy who was actively doing the grift. Like, you see him doing the charismatic stuff, doing the speaking in tongues in front of a crowd, and literally 5 minutes later in the documentary, he's like counting his money in the back, like on the bed. It's such a cynic. When people talk, they have these cynical takes about evangelicalism. Like, that's the proof of it right there. Like, it really is that bad for a lot of these people. It really is.
I live in the Metroplex. We've got those guys are a dime a dozen up here.
Yeah.
I wanted to say part of that experience is partly what drove me. I went to a Disciples of Christ college, university, Texas Christian University.
Oh, TCU! You went to TCU. Okay, all right. I know some folks from TCU,
and I had the best religion professor ever.
Okay.
And that's at that point, that's pretty much what concretized my atheism.
The religion class.
Thank you, Doctor.
Interesting.
Well, the whole course of study. The class that meant the most was cults and sects. SECTS, cults and sects.
Sure.
And church-state relationship. And this guy was an authority on church-state relationship. So, yeah. And then I had a brief dabbling with New Agey stuff, and then I finally became a critical thinker. So,
good for you.
I just wanted to share the story that,
Thanks for sharing that story, Phil. Yeah, I quite enjoyed that. Yeah, I quite enjoyed that.
Great show.
Oh, thanks so much for calling in. Definitely a fun little anecdote. MD, I was talking for most of that. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, I think it's very interesting. And again, I'm like reflecting back because in my undergrad days, there was like a very strong evangelical campus church.
Yeah.
And I got the same sense of that insidious creep, right? Mm-hmm. They would, whether like planned or not, they would sort of seek out positions of power. Their reps would be running for like the president of the student association or whatever. And they had a large voting body, right? That they could unify to push a candidate. They were very good at organizing and all these things. So I find it interesting that was observed. And I wonder how much of it's planned and how much of it is, just people following their, the rules or whatever they think they ought to do because of their faith.
Yeah, and especially, speaking as somebody who was part of an evangelical Christian group in college, a big part of that was the social stuff, right? Sure. Like, I grew up in a Christian household. I grew up in a Christian culture. It made sense to go to a group that aligned with my sense of values and what I thought was true at the time, right? And so, like, that's a gateway to other stuff. And I definitely see people go down that path where they can get even more hardcore into it. I was specifically part of Campus Crusades, now called Crew, and Crew really does emphasize going on missions. And you'll see kids who don't have a lot of money, who are at school because they worked hard and they got scholarships, but who are spending thousands of dollars of money that either they raised or they're finding funding for, to go to Russia, to go to all these places, to go to, places where people don't need that. And that money could be spent in other places. And that's pretty radical. Like, that's a radical thing to do, to go to another country to spread your ideology. But like, we just treat it as so normal. Like, missions is just such a normal thing. It's so
true.
Interesting.
If you take it out of the context of like even Christianity, it becomes odd, right? Can you imagine like a Muslim missionary coming to like Texas to spread their ideology? They'd be labeled as something else.
Yeah. Imagine a Muslim like a missionary going to Baylor University to try to spread Islam. Like, that's not going to fly. We're not going to accept it here. But for some reason, people think they have the liberty to go to another place and tell them.
Colonial mindset.
It really is, dude. It's a colonizer mindset. It really is. Yeah. Good way to put it.